Hello and welcome to today's webinar hosted by Educator, Innovator, and the National Association for Media Literacy Education. Educator Innovator is powered by the National Writing Project and serves as an online hub for educators and organizations who value open learning and whose interests and spirits exemplify connected learning. The National Association for Media Literacy Education is a national organization dedicated to media literacy. NAMELY's mission is to be the leading voice, convener, and resource to foster critical thinking and effective communication for empowered media participation. The NAMELY vision is to see media literacy as highly valued by all and widely practiced as an essential life skill for the 21st century. You can find links to both organizations in the material adjacent to this video. I'm your guest host, Rebecca Reynolds, and I'm an associate professor at Rutgers University in the School of Communication and Information, Department of Library and Information Science. My research investigates social constructivist human learning in naturalistic online participatory settings, including social media environments and MOOCs. I also consider instructional technology design to meet specific educational goals and objectives, for instance, in schools. I explore how system design affordances can support and constrain knowledge building, sharing and meaning making at individual and group levels. I conduct my work in a range of different knowledge domains, including computer science education and game design, digital literacy, and information literacy instruction. I have the pleasure of convening an exciting panel today entitled Fostering Media Literacy and Information Literacy Among Students in a Post-Truth Era: Fake News, Social Media, and an Evolving Instructional Agenda. I'm very fortunate to be joined by three amazing colleagues. The first is Catherine G. Fry, Professor of Media Studies and Chair of the Department of Television and Radio at the Brooklyn College of the City University of New York. And Catherine teaches and publishes in the areas of media ecology, media literacy, and cultural analysis of journalism. Catherine is interested in the changing definition of news and journalism as our communication technologies evolve. She's developed and teaches a model of activist media literacy education based on her grassroots media literacy education work as co-founder and former education director of the nonprofit New York City-based organization, The Lamp. Wendy Stevens teaches children's literature, instructional leadership, and school librarianship courses in the School of Education at Jacksonville State University in Jacksonville, Alabama. After working in both print and broadcast media, she spent 15 years as a high school librarian before she joined the faculty of JSU as school library program chair in 2015. She has national board certification in library media and was the first Google certified teacher in Alabama. She earned her PhD from the University of North Texas, where her doctoral dissertation focused on the relationships between graphic novel reading and teen attitudes towards literacy and libraries. And we also have Peter Adams, who is the News Literacy Project Senior Vice President of Education and is based in Chicago. Peter began his career in education as a classroom teacher in the New York City schools. He has also worked as a trainer in the New York City Teaching Fellows Program, a youth media after-school instructor in the Chicago Public Schools, and as an adjunct instructor at Roosevelt University and Chicago City College's Wilbur Wright campus. He's a graduate of Indiana University, where he majored in English and African American Studies and co-founded an independent monthly student paper, and has a master's degree in the humanities from the University of Chicago. So I welcome my esteemed panel. I'm excited to have you all on board, and thank you very much for your time and energy in putting together amazing discussion here today with me. And so regarding today's topic, fake news has been described as a kind of yellow journalism or propaganda that consists of deliberate misinformation or disinformation or hoaxes spread by a traditional print and broadcast news media or online social media. This form of fake news can be written or published with the intent to mislead in order to damage an agency or entity, person, and also to gain financially or politically. And oftentimes this content is seen as sensationalist, exaggerated, or patently false, and includes headlines that grab attention. And we see this having proliferated in social media around the 2016 presidential campaign. So we've seen this idea of fake news rise to the national level of discussion around media and information literacy education and critical thinking. Today's panelists will discuss this concept, modes of instruction for addressing this issue, and share their perspectives on what further conceptualization and actions may be needed for educators to successfully navigate today's evolving media climate, with a view towards and disinformation campaigns and cultivating our students' greater media discernment. So first we'll hear from Catherine, and then we'll toggle to Wendy, and then Peter. And I will close with a few questions for our panel and lead just an impromptu discussion at the end. So without further ado, I want to welcome Professor Catherine Fry, and we will take it from there. Please join me in welcoming Professor Catherine Fry.
All right. Thank you very much, Rebecca. I appreciate it. I'm going to, let me see, I want to bring up my slides first, and then let me begin by just talking about the fact that while I am appreciative of the term fake news, and I appreciate the discourse around it, and I understand the sense of panic and concern that people have, I want to reframe the conversation a little bit today and just start off by saying I'm not crazy about that term fake, because for me, the term fake assumes that there is like an absolute objective real that exists out there. And I'm not sure that's the case. And the way that I have approached this topic since this term has been used is to encourage people to think historically about news and to think about the fact that news has in fact been changing since the beginning of when we first had this thing called news. And I'm going to go back to the earliest days of the American Republic. Don't worry, I'm not going to spend a lot of time there. But I do feel like it's important to establish some sort of historical timeline just to show that as our communication media have changed and as the way that news has been presented and shaped in different communication media, from print all the way to electronic media to the internet, the very definition of news has changed. And we've never been living in any sort of golden era where news has been completely and absolutely true. So having said that, let me just take you through a couple of slides and give people perhaps a different way of thinking about all of this. So here's my quick sort of historical rundown. So back in the earliest days of news in the United States, whatever was news was the product of one person who happened to have the technology to put out a newspaper or some sort of sheet of information, and it was available to people who happened to be able to read and had access to it. And that one person could say whatever he or she, well, it was always he, whatever he wanted to say. It was completely partisan. It was completely subjective. There was no such notion of objectivity at that point. And it wasn't until the 19th century, with the beginning of the mass production of newspapers and what is referred to as the penny press era, that we even thought about news as having as being full of facts and having any sort of objectivity. But bear in mind, of course, that during the 19th century, as these newspapers were rising and competing with each other, there was a lot of made-up stuff that was being printed in newspapers. There are a lot of different examples of how various big-time, news moguls were just, creating fake stuff. So it's interesting to me that the term is sort of considered new today. It's not really new. And that's not my way of saying it doesn't matter. It does matter. I'm just offering a different sort of historical framework for looking at it. Then in the beginning of the 20th century, we had the rise of radio as a news source. And then quickly on the heels of that, television in the mid-century became the source of most people's news, including network, local, and cable. And then it's only been a very short period of time that we have had this internet and social media as being a major source of news. It's been a really short period of time, and that short period of time we've seen a whole new reframing, a whole new environment, I would say. And I think that's causing some concern. All right, so the next slide. So I want to talk just a little bit about how the fact that news is constructed, because that's kind of my go-to teaching mode. I think it's really important that people understand that the modes of communication used to shape information are very different from each other, and they have a very different impact on the audience. So for example, with newspapers, you've got words and you've got still photographs. I'm talking about, your basic, hard newspapers. We still have them. They are fewer in number. But newspapers shape information using words and photographs. Radio obviously only has sound as its mode. Television is a combination of words, still and moving visuals, graphics, sound, editing choices, all of it. It's a very compact and very dense format. Television also has a much shorter time frame that it's working in. So it varies significantly from radio as a source of information and from newspapers. Then, as I mentioned, of course, we have the internet, which is all about interactivity through social media. It's algorithm run. It is a collapsed hierarchy. I'm going to explain a little bit more what I mean by that in just a moment. But before I move on to the next slide, I think it's important that people understand that each of these media as constructors of information is a completely different information environment, shaping information, news, if you will, in very different ways. And therefore, to me, the terms truth and falsity are a little bit obscuring, or they're a very sort of surface way of thinking about how information is constructed across media. All right, so now I want to just launch into a little bit of explanation about how the fact that all information, and news in particular, is very constrained by a lot of different elements. On the one hand, as I've just described in my earlier slide, news is constrained by the medium through which it's shaped, okay? And like I said, whether it's words, sound, visuals, editing, all these different ways constrain the kind of information, what the information is that the audience eventually gets. So it's a different kind of information. News is also highly constrained by the organization that puts it out. So in sort of traditional legacy media like newspapers, television news stations, radio news formats, for example, these have traditionally been organizations that have a sort of a hierarchy of reporters, editors, producers, owners that have a lot of voice, a strong voice in saying what should be the news of the day, what's the way that we should cast the information, what are we going to leave in, what are we going to take out, and all of this is very it's complex, but it's very much the tradition of legacy news. So a lot of different people are involved in the decision-making process. And that has traditionally been the way that news has been cast and recast. And the audience traditionally has not had a lot of say about it. The next point is the hierarchies of the news organizations, which is what I just pretty much explained. Journalists, and I have a degree in journalism myself, and I remember being trained as a newspaper journalist as an undergraduate, and I remember being trained to ask certain types of questions when I'm covering a story, and to interview certain kinds of people, who are the right people to interview, who are the wrong people to interview. And there was always this underlying notion that there is a way that one can be an objective as a journalist. And it wasn't until I started studying journalism as a scholar that I realized that there's there's a lot of bias that's embedded in the way that journalists are trained. And I became very, very interested in this notion of objectivity. And I have to say, I'm firmly in the camp of saying that there is no such thing as objectivity necessarily. And for all the reasons that I just gave you. The final point that I want to make about news, no matter which medium it is, broadcast in or printed in or made available in, economics are a huge constraining factor. In the traditional world of news and information and the traditional news channels, it's been advertising constraints. And there are a lot of examples given, where advertisers have put a stop to certain kinds of news being transmitted because they were paying for it and it didn't look good for them, for example. In the current news environment, which is the digital environment, which I'm going to talk a little bit more because it's the actual 21st century reality that we're living in, it's not so much the traditional advertising constraint as we knew it, but more the algorithms that are driving the economy of news. And that has everything to do with the way that people participate in news today. So participation is a huge factor in the social media environment that we're living in today. So we have, here we are in almost, we're edging close to the mid 21st century, believe it or not. And social media, I think we can all agree, is the environment, the communication environment that we're most embedded in currently, especially with regard to news. And it's been a complete game changer. So legacy news is still with us, but legacy news, newspapers, television news stations, radio stations, all rely heavily on the participation that happens through social media like Facebook and Twitter, and even Snapchat, believe it or not, is considered, a viable and important source of information, display and participation and circulation. So that means that the traditional hierarchy of news has nearly collapsed and that almost anyone has access, and especially the everyday social media user is able to participate like never before in sharing and even creating news that they never had access to before. And so what this means is that the traditional journalistic notions of truth, reliability, and objectivity have brand new meanings. And I want to explain a little bit about what I mean by that. Part of my research in the past few years has been towards interviewing news audiences and just talking to people, actual news users and participants, how they define news today, where they go for their news, and what do they think news is now. And it's been fascinating for me. Most recently, I conducted focus groups with students here at Brooklyn College, mostly undergrads, and then students at Bilkent University in Turkey, because that's where I was living and teaching just 2 years ago. And I asked them the same questions, and without going into all the details about that research and what I was able to find, one of the things that really stood out for me in my conversations with those students is the fact that all of them, almost to a person, said that they consider truth in news and reliability in news to be what they're able to glean when they themselves go to a lot of different sources, and especially compare the news coming from lay people that are on the ground at an event as it's happening, and compare it to how traditional news organizations are covering it. All of the students expressed a lot of skepticism about traditional news for various different reasons. Some because they understand the advertising drivenness of a lot of corporate news, and they also had a fear of government censorship, and that was particularly with the Turkish students. So they didn't use truth, reliability, or objectivity as terms to describe any sort of one media story that might come out. They didn't think that that's where truth or reliability lay. They felt like it was up to them to discern it, to determine it by their own participation and their own sort of archiving of news. I found that fascinating and a really, really important thing to consider when rethinking the way that news happens today. So, you know, I'm very interested in media literacy. I consider news literacy to be a part of media literacy. And I think that the digital environment is the environment, like I said, that we're living in. So a couple of things to keep in mind. First of all, you know, news, like I said, is an evolving genre. It's been evolving since we've started using the term news, and it evolves in new environments of communication. Our current environment is a digital environment, and we need to understand the digital environment above all. I think all media genres are blurring now in this new participatory environment. Participation is key. We need to understand how it operates. We need to understand how people participate and why it's changed the rules. And I think people need to really take responsibility for how they are participating. It's upon all of us. And I think that's where media literacy education plays a really important role in preparing people to understand just what kind of environment that we're living in, because it's affecting how we understand not just news and information, but how we understand each other and we understand our world. Very quickly, just a couple of questions that I have posed on screen here. There are a lot more to ask, but just as a way of getting people started in thinking about how do we talk to not just young people, but everybody about assessing information online, because I know that that's a huge thing for a lot of people, is just like, how do we teach people to assess? Okay, so if that's the conversation, here are just a couple of questions you can throw out there. I know that other media literacy educators have offered very similar sort of checklists. But the first question to always ask when encountering anything online or in legacy media is just ask, who produced the piece? Okay, what do we know about that producer? What do we understand to be their agenda, or what are they getting out of it? Who's paying for it? Is it is it a traditional advertiser that's paying the bill for us to have access to this information? If it's on social media, who gains if we click on this story and if we share this story? Who's getting what out of it? What are the tactics that are being used to get us to click on a story? We're all, we've all seen a million times these hyperbolic terms that are used, or these pictures that are posted, and then once you click on the story, you see that really that was just clickbait, and the story is not at all what it promised to be. That's a really basic thing. When you see something like that, ask a lot of serious questions before you even go ahead and click on it, because somebody's getting something out of your clicking on it. And it's good to know what that might be. Finally, when you get into a story, just try to figure out what's the focus here? What's the purpose of it? What is maybe being left out of this story? And, probably a lot. And then finally, the biggest question for me is, how am I participating in all of this information flow? What responsibilities do I have as a typical social media user? It's a lot of stuff. I feel like I talked through a lot of stuff very, very quickly. I'm happy to share any information with anybody who would want to contact me offline or in another way about my research, about, a sort of deeper understanding about the digital environment and how to approach it from sort of a media literacy / news literacy perspective. So I'll leave it at that, and now I'm going to turn myself over to Wendy Stevens, who has more to say.
Thank you very much. That was just excellent. It reminds me a lot of the adage about if the service is free, the odds are that you're the product. You're the one whose information is actually being harvested and being used. And I do tend to be a little conservative when it comes to the information that I like to share compared to a lot of people that I know. But I do think it's so important to think about how all of that is really influencing the media landscape, what we are doing to interact with that media ecosystem, and how that's then driving what we end up seeing. And I think one of the major things is that there is no more Walter Cronkite. There's no more shared media experience that a lot of people had together, and that was coming kind of from a centralish direction. So regardless of the quality of the journalism and the fact that it was going to be that constructed reality, which I felt that Catherine did such a wonderful job in explaining all these different constraints on media production. But regardless of that, now we experience things relatively asynchronously, and I'm thinking about the famous Dewey defeats Truman. I don't know if I am in slideshow mode. Let me make sure that I have switched over. But I think that you had these moments which were experienced kind of as a shared thing, and that's not necessarily even the case anymore. It seems like we're often hearing about percentages of the population that don't know fundamental things about that are going on, which are really consuming another segment of the population, because it is so possible to construct a filter bubble where the information that you encounter really does reinforce your own biases. Another thing, there used to be, I think, a lot more media mentoring. You would have watching television as not only a family experience, but often a community experience. And oftentimes now it's presented with that commentary already embedded. You've selected your sources via, Apple News, or if you're one of the 62% of Americans that gets a lot of your news via social media. However you're getting it, you've made decisions about which sites to follow. And one of the things that I find particularly fascinating are the rise of these things like Burst Your Bubble by The Guardian, or Slate does a sort of alternative site of the week. Well, just the idea that these sites have to be highlighted and presented, and that they're going to be something that the readership is not coming across sort of in the natural course of events, really does indicate a big fracture. And I like to think of that as, we've never at any point in time been as likely to be surrounded by people who have similar socioeconomic realities and professional backgrounds that we do now. Schools particularly are becoming much more racially identifiable than they were, but more so economically identifiable, and this sort of sorting based on savvy and income, I think we see based on the fact that people who live in low-income neighborhoods are less likely to have certain kinds of internet access. They're less likely to have Wi-Fi, high-speed access. They're more likely to be mobile only. And thinking about really the constraints that puts on you, not so much as an information consumer, that of course that is a factor, but as an information producer. You're really not kind of able to participate in publication in the same way, in the same sort of empowered way that you might if you had, more robust connectivity. I think that, there is a digital divide, and I think that it largely is, mobile versus more robust computing, and that line is blurring, and there are extraordinary things that are produced on mobile devices, but it is more difficult, and you have to be a lot more intentional about that. I feel like the standard sort of academic products are still those that you're going to need more keyboard functionality, that sort of thing. Newspaper circulation, that legacy media that Catherine was speaking about before, is continuing to fall. And again, that's another shared avenue of communication that has eroded. And now, it's entirely possible for the entire family to all be, looking at different things, having different mediations of the same sort of experience, where they would have been focused on that single television set, years before. Ideally, this is great for marginalized voices, people who might not otherwise be able to scrape together a readership or a listenership or sponsorship from a small number of people. We've seen crowdsourcing and sort of patron funding really explode, and I think that's going to continue to grow for media organizations as people realize that maybe media is worth investing in. I think that the record readership of when you count the online subscribers of some of the media outlets today show that people really are, some people are willing to pay for information, but again, that's a distinction that's going to be made largely on class. And as I mentioned before, we're surrounding ourselves with people that are similar to ourselves, even though we may claim that we're being individualistic as we're creating all these bits and bytes, and as we run across the internet and interact with news, and increase the probability of the news that we encounter the next time will be like that. I don't think most people have any indication of sort of the amount of data that's being harvested from them through the many advertising extensions that are running every time you search, major sites, products that track you from site to site, associate your offline behaviors like credit cards, buying of prescription medicines, things like that, with your online behaviors to really give data corporations a really accurate and intimate picture of people's lifestyles. You may have heard the story about the teenage girl who Target intuited that she was expecting a baby before her family did, because the patterns of her purchases that she was making at Target with a credit card, which allows them to store and collate that information, indicated that her behavior was that of someone who was expecting a baby. So they sent her baby coupons and started this whole dialogue. But I do think we have, even as I said, we may look to have more differences. It's possible that the digital realm does allow for more creativity, but on campus there is still a huge pressure. This is, I think that anyone who's on campus realizes that every campus has its sort of ways and means, and the networks that are existing there contribute to the sense of well, this must be true because all of my friends have seen this and it's been promoted by someone I know, and this is, everyone I know is posting about this particular hashtag. So again, the news is sort of pre-digested and there's a commentary on it before you become involved with it. So all the people that are interacting with these social media sites that are then cross-referencing all these information from these other platforms, I always tell students, I think one of the best things that they can do is just obfuscate, that when they're signing terms of service, it's really not like signing a legal contract. Who's to say that you're not, the 75-year-old woman in Omaha, to go ahead and take those liberties just for the sake of making those types of information less valuable, degrading their worth. I think I remember reading that, while the name of the average American and their buying habits were worth something along the nature of 50 cents, that people who were expecting babies, it went up to around $3, because that's the difference, that marketers know they're going to be buying particular products, and they can do very faceted marketing based on your zip code. They can do differential pricing. They can do special offers based on your behaviors in the past. They might offer some types of loyalty incentives. But every time I get a solicitation for someone either intended for someone much younger than me or much older than me, or someone who's expecting a baby, I feel like I've sort of won, because I've defeated some sort of commercial marketing program somewhere. I do think that Facebook can be a crazy place. Where I am right now, we're in the midst of a midterm Senate race, and the news is really crazy. There is, I saw an analysis today which said that in response to the Las Vegas shootings, Democratic congresspeople were 60% of them mentioned guns in the response to that event, that tragedy, whereas Republican congresspeople were only 2% of them mentioned guns specifically in response to that. So when you're able to sort of quantify those things, and and the thing is, I think a lot of times these ideas get promoted and there's no correction. It may immediately be dispelled, or if you read the article itself, the analysis may not be exactly what is suggested by the title. So much of the time, this stuff is just optimized for the web. What you're going to see in terms of your headline, your cut lines, your graphics are going to be what's been proven to attract people to the sites, not just to click through, but also to stay on the sites. That's another metric that's very valuable, because that proves attention, and we are in this attention economy. So, I try to tell my students that they're sort of paying with their attention. It's that transaction that I was sort of implying in the beginning. But what's absolutely fascinating to me is the fact that all of these people who are basically reporting on themselves on Facebook all the time, they're documenting all their sort of bad behavior. They're creating sort of a dossier that people can go back and point to. I was just reading a book or a long form story about a woman who'd been involved in a crime, and it went back and it analyzed 5 years of Facebook posts from this woman, where she'd gone from living in a village to living in a city and gone through this sort of transformation. But it was just amazing to me that they felt like this was just fodder that they could plumb for whatever they wanted. So I think it's important that we do say privacy is an option. It may not be the norm, but it is something that you can choose to actively decide to do. This is a link, and I'm hoping that you can put this up. It was a really excellent collection of things that were circulated via our state library association that had to do with these sorts of topics, especially from I guess maybe trying to situate this in terms of a larger trend, and I do think it will continue to be. I think in some ways this is great because it's a teachable moment. Our students are living in a really teachable moment, and there are all these plugins that you can use to transform your social media feeds to those of someone with opposite political views, and I think that is the most valuable conversation to have with people right now, is to say, do you know how partitioned your own media consumption has become? Because unless you take these sort of active steps, it is very easy to get very, very narrow, and to get that sort of reinforcement that what you believe is the case is indeed the case. And again, it creates a fracture in society that I don't think is particularly good. But thank you all for inviting me. I enjoyed Catherine's presentation so much, and I'm really very much looking forward to hearing from Peter Adams. I think that the News Literacy Project is doing some exciting work, so I'm really eager to hear more about what's going on there, because, like I said, I think this is the opportune moment to be having these conversations and really training the next generation of citizens to make these decisions.
Thanks, Wendy. Let me get my get my screen share set up here. All right, so we have a pretty limited amount of time, so I wanted to just touch on the topic of fake news as a type of misinformation and sometimes disinformation. And why I'm worried about the overextension, the weaponization, the politicization of that term. It is a very trendy term. It is a term that gets clicks and is highly interesting to people. It also packs conference workshops, I've noticed, as I make the rounds at various conferences. So everybody's interested in it. Catherine's right. It's nothing new. But there is a renewed public awareness about fake news. So just briefly, you can find the News Literacy Project here online at our virtual classroom, which is called the Checkology Virtual Classroom here at checkology.org. It's free to register for and use one-to-one with students. You can also find us on social media here. And I've just launched a new weekly email newsletter, kind of a weekend news literacy rundown called The Sift, sending every Friday. I'm actually polishing it up right now. for this week, and you can register for that and check out previous editions at the SIFT. So at the newsliteracyproject.org/the SIFT. And that just gives teachers a variety of examples and ideas for integrating news literacy into their classrooms with a quick bell ringer or discussion, all the way up to PBL and student-directed engagement. So fake news as a category, I think, despite the way the term has been deployed, it is important for us to track what this actually is. So information that is like this, entirely fabricated or false, and the vast majority of it, like America's Last Line of Defense, sort of hides behind a thin veil of satirical disclosure. So I call it disingenuous satire, I think is a good way to think about fake news, because it is just constructed to get clicks. So the headlines have a relationship to actual social issues, to divisive social issues, and people's passions and people's emotions, particularly now with the deep political and partisan ideological divisions in the U.S., get people clicking, and clicks make money. So these purveyors of fake news really, many of them are only interested in the revenue that this generates. Many of these sites were started as jokes. Many of these sites were started just to see what they could get people to believe and click on. Here's an example on the left in the wake of Hurricane Harvey, a repurposed image from a Boston protest in 2015 that Black Lives Matter protesters were blocking hurricane relief supplies on the highway in Houston. And that's intended to generate outrage and a click. And even if you land on the page and quickly debunk it, it's like a flash grenade. It's already gotten its page view. It's already made its money. And if it's able to rack up enough page views, it can translate into real revenue. That particular rumor was especially pernicious because Black Lives Matter was actually involved in delivering aid in the wake of Harvey. A lot of these sites mimic the look and feel of institutional news media, or they are presented as sort of alternatives to mainstream news that doesn't want to tell you this, that, or the other thing that's going to get you to click. So here's a pretty famous fake news site called abcnews.com.co. That's its URL. It vaguely looks like the ABC logo, and it is definitely designed to trick folks, as it did Corey Lewandowski and Eric Trump back last year, a year ago. The other stories are outrageous. They're intended to prompt intense curiosity, and it taps into a little bit of what attracts people to conspiracy theories, and again, tapping into partisan passions. So I, again, like to sort of think of fake news as a category of misinformation or disinformation pretty tightly. And I'm concerned about, folks who use the term too loosely, because I think a lot is lost when we do so. But we do need, I think, to keep track of that particular kind of misinformation. One activity you can do is to take a site like America's Last Line of Defense, and if you don't want to give them a page view, which I urge you not to, you can actually Google America's Last Line of Defense and right-click the homepage or right-click a link to a story, copy the URL, and go to archive.is or go to the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine and drop that copied link into the archiver. And then you can share that archived link with students, which will not drive traffic to the site itself. But if you do take a look at a fake news site and sort of deconstruct it with students, you'll notice clues that are pretty subtle that this is satire. So this story is filed under the site section potatoes. This one is filed under beefaroni, which makes no sense. Of course, most people obviously don't see that one until they click. And by the time you've clicked and landed on the page, they've accomplished their goal. There are also, semi-subtle declarations that this is satire. Those articles were written by Freedom, so the byline was just Freedom. And Freedom's little bio here has a lot of clues and red flags that this is not credible information. And then they do have a small about disclaimer, basically saying that everything on this site is satirical and a work of fiction, but you have to look. And then there's a big satire S-rated label there. PolitiFact, under their Pundit Fact section of their site, has created a collection of URLs. And it hasn't been updated in a month or two, but this was the list last time I sort of pulled those URLs down. And it's interesting to just look at the URLs and see if you can notice patterns, and then look at themes. Again, two big themes that stick out are mimicking institutional news media, mimicking standards-based journalism, or presenting yourself as an alternative, so trying to sort of exploit people's cynicism about institutional news media and saying, here's a story that the news media doesn't want to tell you. A great place to go for examples on in a timely way is the What's New section of the Snopes website, and then you can filter by the tag fake news. So they have a fake news tag. They also have a photography tag for manipulated images. So when you're looking for something, a viral rumors, sometimes viral rumors are a great kind of side door into civic engagement, social conversations with students. Again, you can just take a high-level view of the recent fake news stories that Snopes has taken on, and notice patterns, right? Mandalay Bay has thrown off a ton of fake news and rumors. All the debates about the national anthem and the NFL, now Halloween and clowns and rumors of clowns, creepy clowns, murderous clowns are all over the place. That gets people clicking again. So my quick piece on why we should not call all misinformation fake news is that, one, fake news is a very specific misinformation strategy. And that misinformation that's not presented as news or as credible information is something else, right? So if it's not created as a piece of journalism, not intended to look like news, it's actually something else. So a hoax, a manipulated image, a meme isn't really presented as news. And then conflating things like rumors and hoaxes and false claims, and especially, I think, mistakes in journalism, which are part of the process of practicing journalism. They are regrettable but inevitable. They happen with a fair amount of frequency. Most are rather minor and get corrected. But if you equate mistakes in journalism with fake news, the way that some political figures have, that really obscures and ends inquiry, to sort of overextend that term. I wanted to point out a couple of recent trends in fake news production. So a lot of sites are now outsourcing the production of fake news to users, so sort of crowdsourcing it by creating templates like Break Your Own News, where you can create a headline, you can create a lower third, you can upload an image, and they make it very frictionless to share to social. So you'll notice the post to Facebook, post to Twitter, post to Tumblr links below. They're essentially not paying freelancers to write these pieces the way other operations do. They're letting everyone create fake news to fool their friends, tweak the news, and share it on social. And when that drives page views, the generator site hosts those pieces and makes the revenue. Here's another one: easy to trick all your friends, and they'll get a message that they got owned, but actually you kind of sold their eyeballs to this site which got ad revenue because they clicked on it when you shared it on social. So helping students really avoid engaging in this kind of stuff, I think, is important. Here's a site that lets you choose a celebrity and make a fake news piece about that celebrity. People have used this site to create stories that all Taco Bells are to close by June 1st, for example. That got people clicking, so much so that the AP walked it back in their new Not Real News rundown of fake news and viral rumors. Things like, a very popular candy being discontinued is a really effective strategy for fake news purveyors. Here's another site that helps you prank your friends. And I always encourage media literacy and news literacy educators to not have students do this. I have heard folks at times say, I have students create fake stories, even share fake stories, or try to get people to, try to see who can create the best or most convincing fake story. I really am concerned about having students create misinformation. There's enough misinformation out there to take on as object lessons and teachable moments that we don't have to have students engaging in creating it. Here's another one, and yet another one. Twerker is actually a site that lets you edit headlines and then republish them and share them as JPEGs. And I think having students use tools like that to create fake information as an object lesson, I understand the motivation. I affirm the end goal, which is to have students be informed about fake news, but I think it's a little bit like teaching students about pollution by having them actually pollute. and it concerns me a lot. So I always tell educators, this is a bad idea, don't do it. A couple other trends that we're seeing kind of on the misinformation landscape is the blending of authentic or genuine journalism and fake news, and also raw documents. So that happened with the leaks of the Macron campaign in France. There were authentic emails mixed with inauthentic emails. That was sort of a development from the Podesta leaks in the US, which were all authentic, to the Macron leaks, which had fake emails mixed in with authentic just to create a general atmosphere of confusion. There was also an incident where the Guardian's entire website was copied. You can copy the HTML code of any website and rehost it at a new URL that looked very much like the Guardian's URL, except it used a Turkish character that looks like a lowercase I without the dot. So it was very easy to think you were looking at the Guardian, and then fake stories were inserted among the real stories that were copied from the Guardian. That appears to have been a Russian state-sponsored effort. So that's something I think to keep on students' radar, is the intentional blending of authentic and inauthentic documents and information. We also saw a recent story this week about programmatic ad servers like Google's AdSense placing ads to sites that were posing as People Magazine, Cosmopolitan, Vanity Fair, that actually weren't affiliated with those publications, but they used their logos. And then those got placed on fact-checking websites because obviously PolitiFact and Snopes need the advertising revenue to operate, so they sell real estate on their website for programmatic ad placements, but they're not in control of what gets served. And if we all go to PolitiFact right now, we might all be served a different ad, as Wendy was talking about, based on our browsing history. So just to wrap up, I think other things like this doctored image, which was well known in the wake of Harvey and a bunch of other hurricanes, sites like eBuzz that try to drum up a following, sharing old and repurposed context, old and repurposed videos and pictures, and give them a new context every time there's an event that gives them an opportunity to do so, sometimes to sell their accounts. People who Photoshop celebrities wearing shirts with different messages. This is the authentic shirt, by the way. These kinds of things are not fake news. They're not presented as news. They're presented as raw information, amazing nature photos, astonishing, user-generated stuff. So I think we get into trouble if we start to call these kinds of mimetic rumors and viral rumors, image-based rumors, fake news. And there were also, tweets. So there's a lot of faking of authentic seeming content. So a lot of people think that the way to get to the truth of a situation is to go to social media and see what people are tweeting. And in the wake of Hurricane Harvey, there was a fake campaign to convince people that looting was happening that wasn't. And it used the Black Lives Matter hashtag. It used heavy-handed racial stereotypes, definitely sought to sort of stir up racist sentiment among folks. And they basically took images from across the web. So that box of ashes, or that container for ashes, is actually from Etsy. This is a screenshot from a YouTube video, just to sort of construct the appearance that looting was happening. This is an old picture that's all over the web. And, it's supposed to be Houston in August and everybody's in coats. So you can have students engage in some digital forensics, do some reverse image searching, and really explore a lot of this stuff. There was a similar hashtag in the wake of the Freddie Gray hearing in Baltimore that pulled pictures from around the web, including this overtly racist and Daily Mail piece. But that's actually a Kentucky Fried Chicken in Karachi, Pakistan. So I think it's important to sort of give students that understanding. And finally, I think it is important to help students understand what the aspirational standards of quality journalism are, why they matter, what good sourcing looks like, what the role of documents and evidence is in a credible piece of information, why it's important to pursue neutrality. So I agree with Catherine that it's not perfect objectivity. Is almost certainly impossible for any human to achieve. And even if it were possible, we're all too biased ourselves as consumers to know what it looks like. But I think pursuing neutrality, wrestling with questions about what is more or less neutral in terms of word choice and news judgment is a very worthwhile pursuit that yields dividends and is an important part of the national conversation, or plays an important role. And then trying to be fair. I'm pursuing fairness, providing readers with context, the process of verification, verifying something before you publish it, being accountable for mistakes. These aren't controversial. We could all disagree and argue about which news outlets or which sources of information aspire to these kinds of standards in the best way and the most effective way. But the standards themselves are not, I think, controversial. We can all agree that these are important. So teaching students what those are and what they look like in practice, I think, empowers them to really detect and avoid the kinds of misinformation I've been showing, help them recognize quality journalism when they see it. So I think it's really, really important that we show students and use quality coverage as an object lesson as well. We shouldn't only show students news reports when they're somehow flawed or when we're going to criticize them or tear them down, but also show them exemplary investigative pieces, exemplary community coverage, so that they can compare and they have actually a reference point. And then it helps students enter and hopefully, I think, be heard in conversations about trust. So once they master those standards and have a working understanding of those standards, they can then really reach out and respond to coverage in a way that's much more empowering than if they don't have that fundamental skill set. So that's my piece. I'm going to, I think, yield back to Rebecca here. Let me figure out how to stop sharing my screen.
And actually, Stephen, sorry, Peter, before you do that, do you mind actually scrolling back to your standard slide? Because I wanted to ask a question that
Sure.
slide actually kind of gives some good framing for.
Sure.
So I want to thank Catherine, Wendy, and Peter for a really amazing and substantive set of material here for our audience to grapple with. It's a challenging topic, and we have heard, so it actually turned out well, the sequence, because we heard from Catherine on some historical perspectives and discussion of, variations in media information environments as they've changed and evolved across history. We've heard about, some constraints in the news formats and the ways that new media frames uses of and sharing of traditional kind of more news-oriented content in, different information flows than we've seen before. We have heard from Wendy on, in particular, what I kind of take away from Wendy's presentation was a discussion of, the silos of the like-minded that we have emerging and the partitioning of, news groupings and audience groupings based on people's friendship networks and the ways that, people are posting, sharing, and opining on, their perspectives around the content that they're sharing. But that this is occurring, very much within these kind of like-minded silos, such that 62% of Americans are getting their news through the social media gateway. And we talked also about the data harvesting, and then Peter chimed in with some really amazing concrete examples for people who are thinking about how to raise the topic of fake news with their students, and some amazing resources for doing that that are very powerful, that can show students, very specifically what to look for in the content that they're viewing and clicking and consuming and sharing. And so this was a really interesting slide, because I think, Peter, that you're right to say that it's important to share with our students that while we want to sort of question this idea of objectivity, and that has been kind of one of the tenets of media education, is to bring about critical thinking in our students and to allow them to understand that news is a construct. At the same time, we still want to we want to share with them that there are standards to news production, and that we want to let them know that quality journalism involves the pursuit of neutrality and fairness and balance, and that is a value that has long stood the test of time for the role of journalism in a democracy. Because I think there's been some recent research, and it's been kind of like just sort of, I've seen it in passing, about the ways that U.S. citizens have grown in their skepticism of mainstream media. And also that, given what we're seeing from our current leadership in the U.S. presidential office. We have, a leader who is actually actively promoting a skepticism. And so what I wonder is, whether our young people are becoming skeptical of the wrong content, of content that in fact actually has merit and value, and whether that undermining that we see as potentially a strategy by the Russian intervention, for instance, in the campaign, to undermine our democracy through an erosion of the role of media, whether that's succeeding, and how can we sort of, combat that through active media education? And so what's the best way to kind of convey these types of standards to our students? I'll leave that open to everyone for comment.
I do think I would actually call it cynicism is what I worry about. Skepticism's great. I want students to be skeptical of everything. I want them to ask critical questions of everything that they encounter. But if they're cynical, then that concerns me. So cynicism, assumes you have the answer and actually ends inquiry, right? Skepticism is an invitation to begin a line of inquiry. So if I see what I perceive to be a loaded headline or the use of a term in a loaded way, and I just conclude that that's driven by some kind of systematic agenda, then that's conversation closed. If I explore that phrasing and look at consistency across phrasing, if I look and see if the ombudsman's ever written about that particular word usage, if I ask myself, are my own biases getting wrapped up in this? How could it be more neutral? What would I have done if I were rewriting this headline or choosing an image? Then that's a very rich line of inquiry that you can engage in with students, and one I think that helps protect against the kind of cynical assumption that this is all easier than it actually is.
I think personally, one of the things that we can help students to realize is that you can hold two oppositional points of view and both be somewhat valid. I think, just showing different interpretations of the same events. I love the museum interface, which has the front pages from different media outlets, traditional news, but so indicative of different cultures' takes on sort of the big topics of the day. That's something that I always use to show students how culture can influence the way that the news is reported, and I think that just experiencing that nuance, I think, will help them be more critical of the outlets that they do choose in the future, that the choices have been made for them.
Yeah, I think too, helping students understand the difference between matters of fact and then trying to interpret what a set of facts or a fact pattern might mean or indicate are two very different things, so that we don't arrive at a time, which I think we're grappling with this now and trying to not sort of succumb to this idea that you have your facts and I have mine, that I have, mainstream facts and you have alternative facts, as Kellyanne Conway put it. I think that's a deeply disturbing notion, that we lose track of the fact that there are still things that are demonstrably true, and that those are important to recognize and agree on as the basis for a conversation about how to handle certain problems, what solutions, what public policies work or don't work.
Yeah, and I'd like to chime in. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I just want to chime in. Everything that my colleagues have said points to me again to underscore the fact that it's very important that we take responsibility as educators and just as people who are part of the digital environment to, number one, understand what this environment opens up to us. My colleagues gave really good concrete examples of the complexity of that environment and this new sort of frontier that we've entered, and the ability for people to practice different ways of conversing and to play around with truth and untruth and so on. And there's a huge opportunity here to rethink how we operate. And so responsibility to me is number one. It's the responsibility of the educators to understand the digital environment and teach about it, And in order to make that happen, it's the responsibility of people who are in charge of education to really advocate for the fact that we need media literacy education policies put in place so that this kind of study, the work that the three of us are doing and many, many other people are doing, becomes foundational to how we teach. And I think if we can start there on a really base level, we can start, we can start making some real headway in getting people to wrap their heads around, these issues of participation that are pervasive and are actually foundational to, as you said, Rebecca, our democracy, just the way that we live in the world. So I'm very passionate about that idea, this foundational notion of taking responsibility and know the digital environment.
Sorry, there's a siren going on in the background. I'm just going to pause for one moment. Okay, there we go. Okay, and I'm going to, so thank you so much for that commentary. And Catherine, to sort of dovetail off of what you were just saying, I'd like to end our webinar today on a positive note and ask you all what you kind of think about this trend. I've been sort of mulling around this observation of how interesting it is that, whether it's young people or ourselves, how much we have gravitated towards this position of wanting to always kind of assert and comment and present our opinion about and frame these forwards that we make, these shares that we make in social media, and position it vis-a-vis ourselves, our identities, what we think, and we allow that to kind of evolve over time, our perspectives, as we learn more and more through the content that we're engaging with and learning from, like, within the social constructive environment of the social media landscape, from our friends and from expert sources or not expert sources, etc. How that plays into kind of our identity development. I mean, because I think that all of this sharing is resulting in you could say learning, in a sense, among people who are engaging in it. And I just wonder whether you have thoughts about this kind of active, constructive engagement with this content in new ways, and how it may relate, because we see it parlay itself into activism in some cases, and into real world action and into organization, etc. So do you have any, to end on a kind of an optimistic note, following on what Catherine said, do you have any thoughts on that and how that plays into this process?
I guess the only thing I have to say is that, identity is shifting as well. And when you enter a new communication environment, there's a new way of thinking about who you are. And again, there's a great opportunity here to teach about that and to teach about the fact that one can construct a very thoughtful identity in this new environment. There are great opportunities here. Okay, I'm not going to go down the cynical route. There are great opportunities here for that.
I do think too it's important to not discount the artistry that is present in digital media, and the fact that it is performative to a large extent. So, I don't, I used to know, my high schoolers would have several different accounts on the same platform to share with different groups. One might be a family group, and one might be intimate friends, and another might be, a larger group. But they were very conscious of audience, and they were very conscious of marketing and branding, and of their own, the value of their own product placement and association with places and things and people. And I think we're creating a whole society where people are very they're marketing themselves constantly because of this interconnectivity and the fact that people are so accessible. And like I said, I think that it can be positive and it can be creative. I agree with Catherine. There are amazing opportunities.
Yeah, I think the identity idea. I mean, I really am trying to create resources that help activate students as fact checkers and upstanders for accuracy, to understand why misinformation matters, why it threatens them and their fellow citizens. I think there's no better case study than even this week was a very busy news week on the Russian disinformation front, the activities of the Internet Research Agency in Russia, actually paying people to hold self-defense seminars, to fan the flames of racial tensions in the US, of anxiety about gun control or gun rights, about religion, posing as organizations affiliated with Black Lives Matter, posing as organizations affiliated with Second Amendment rights groups, posing as organizations that are advocating that Texas secede from the Union, and actually organizing protests from abroad. That should outrage everybody, and I think it's a real call to action for teens who. There is no end to the activities you can engage in online, knocking down fake images, doing reverse image searches, answering back, correcting things, calling things out. ProPublica just launched a new hate speech bot that you can report hate speech online to, and then they will sort of add it to their investigations of that problem and try to hold the platforms accountable for enforcing standards in a way that makes sense. And to really engage in that. So I think there are tons of opportunities, tons of tools that students can use that we didn't have time to touch on here, but I would say definitely seek out.
Mm-hmm. Super. Well, Catherine, Wendy, and Peter, I just want to thank you again for your time and for sharing your knowledge with our audience today and with me and with one another. And I also want to thank Namely and Educator Innovator for giving us the platform to be able to discuss these exciting topics. I think we will close it out here and look forward to perhaps some commentary adjacent to this video when it launches online. Thanks, everyone, and have a nice day. Thank you.
Thanks, you too.
Thanks.